Few things can be as exciting or as boring as a police stakeout. Sometimes you can watch a doorway from a car across the street for hours on end and nothing will happen, and all you have to show for it is a sore backside. Or you can be at the right place at the right time and see a crime committed. When I was at the Chicago Tribune, I was on several stakeouts with police. In fact, I remember one. We were staking out a sidewalk because a business executive had hired a hitman by the name of Joey Saladino to murder a business associate. And he said, "I'll give you the initial payment on a public sidewalk." What he didn't know is that Joey Saladino was a phony name and that he was really an undercover cop. So we sat there and we watched and we waited, and sure enough, the business executive shows up. And Joey goes up to him, and we could hear everything through a hidden microphone on Joey. And they made the deal, and he gave him the $300 down payment. And Joey uttered the code word to indicate the transaction was complete. And then doors flew open all over the place, and police jumped out, and they arrested the business executive on a charge of solicitation to commit murder. Now, of course, they had an incredibly strong case against that guy. First, they had Joey Saladino's testimony. Then they had all these incriminating conversations on tape. Now, in the case of Jesus, of course, we don't have any living eyewitnesses from the first century. We don't have any tape recordings of what was said. Nevertheless, we do have accounts that are rooted in eyewitness testimony. So, exactly how reliable are these New Testament writings?
I think, unfortunately, because the documents, the New Testament and specifically, were written so far after Jesus' death, that it's really hard to say.
I don't know myself that it was real. I was not there, but people were there at that time. So their account of things that happened back 2,000 years ago has been passed down.
As an attorney, I rely on evidence. And so, it would be tough to get evidence at this late date.
Well, I began my investigation by looking at the gospel accounts. How did I know that the New Testament was telling me the truth when it talked about Jesus? Now, obviously, I didn't accept the New Testament as being the inspired Word of God. I certainly didn't accept it as being inerrant. But what I had to accept it as being, which it undeniably is a set of ancient historical documents. And I knew that historians had criteria that they could apply to determine whether or not these documents are trustworthy. So those are the kind of people who I pursued. I went after the heavy hitters. I went after the expert witnesses who could help me sort through these issues.
J.P. Moreland, Biola University. Mark Strauss, Bethel Seminary. Craig Blomberg, Denver Seminary. Craig Evans, Acadia Divinity College. N.T. Wright, Bishop of Durham, United Kingdom.
Over the last 250 years, it's been common coin in Western culture that, you can't believe what's said in the Gospels. It's even made into musicals. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, they ain't necessarily so. And that skepticism has wormed its way into much modern culture, and indeed into many Christian circles, many church circles, where they'll say, well, Matthew probably made this bit up, or Luke just added this bit on the end of the parable, or whatever it is. I and others have spent some of the best years of our lives researching what was actually going on in Palestine in the first third of the first century AD, and trying to get inside the minds of first century Jews, first century Romans, different Jewish parties and movements, etc., etc. And the more that I have tried to do that, the more I've found that what you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John comes up in 3 dimensions and says, my goodness, this actually belongs. It makes sense. It fits. It gives us very vivid portraits of who these people were and what they were doing.
The New Testament Gospels are biographies of Jesus. While the authors do not identify themselves in the text, from very early in the Christian era, the Gospels have been attributed to Matthew a disciple or follower of Jesus; Mark, a colleague of Peter, also a disciple; Luke, a historian and confidant of the Apostle Paul; and John, a disciple of Jesus. Both Matthew and John were among the 12, Jesus' closest followers, and constant companions throughout his ministry. They would have personally observed most of the events they described in their Gospels. Mark and Luke were also contemporaries of Jesus and wrote their biographies based upon information provided by many eyewitnesses.
I knew from my years as a legal journalist the importance of eyewitness testimony. In fact, the first question that anybody asks is, how many eyeballs are there? How many eyewitnesses do you actually have? And I needed to determine whether or not contemporary scholars have ascertained whether or not the Gospels are rooted in eyewitness testimony.
It's become evident to scholars of the first century that the Gospels were actually attempts to write biographies of Jesus. Now, not in the modern sense, because the Gospels are not particularly interested in his early years. But when it comes to Jesus' adult life and his activities, these are biographies. They're very clearly attempts by eyewitnesses to describe exactly what Jesus said and did, and the consensus of New Testament scholarship has moved in that direction.
Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 and 2.
Luke's gospel begins with a prologue. It's actually one of the finest Greek sections in the whole New Testament. Luke was clearly a literary artist. But in that prologue, he points out that he has carefully investigated the material that he presents in the Gospels, that he's checked with eyewitness accounts, those who are actually present. If you read that prologue and you see this is the work of a historian, this was someone who has done his research.
Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Luke chapter 1, verses 3 and 4.
You have to understand that people in the first century valued eyewitness testimony. And this is why, from the second century on, it was important to the early church fathers that the people who were alleged to have written the Gospels actually wrote them, and that they were eyewitnesses of the things they wrote.
The New Testament Gospels are by far our earliest and most reliable records of Jesus of Nazareth. All of the New Testament Gospels were written in the first century. Not only are they remarkably close to the events themselves, but in fact, eyewitnesses are still around. If they were passing on untruths, if they were not passing on reliable history, then we would expect eyewitnesses to say, wait a minute, this isn't what happened. But eyewitnesses are around. Eyewitnesses could confirm what they said. All of the gospel writers either were eyewitnesses or interviewed eyewitnesses to gain the information that they gained about Jesus Christ.
As I scrutinized the gospel accounts even further, I realized that it was important to find out not just whether or not the information was rooted in direct and indirect eyewitness testimony, but I needed to know, was this information reliably preserved during the time period before it was finally written down?
We have to put ourselves into the ancient world without modern media, without even a print-based culture in which the only and the standard way of preserving information was through oral tradition, most of which was memorized.
Young rabbis were often forbidden to comment on a passage of Scripture until they had memorized it perfectly. In fact, it was not uncommon for rabbis of Jesus' time to commit the entire Torah to memory.
I've sometimes heard people say, look, I've been in a situation where I whisper something to someone, they whisper it to someone else, and it goes through 10 or 11 people, and by the time the last person tells what was said, it's totally different from what I told the first person. And we can't trust the Gospels for the same reason, because it was transmitted over a long period of time. That illustration is really a bad analogy, and you have to understand that the first century apostles who passed on information about Jesus were deeply concerned to get this information correct, because they saw it as sacred holy tradition. It wasn't about what Joe was eating for dinner last Wednesday night.
In our day of instant media and everything has to be on film or tape recorded, we are more skeptical of oral tradition, but we don't really understand the nature of oral tradition. Oral tradition is a community event. A story is passed down by individuals within that community. Well, if they get it wrong, you've got an entire community that's going to correct them. So it is self-correcting all the way. These stories were passed on reliably because they were passed on by the community of disciples.
In fact, we now have scholarly studies that have been done of oral cultures, and we know that through several generations, oral tradition can be preserved and passed on without changing a thing.
Even though I became convinced that ancient cultures could pass along oral tradition reliably over time, I still had an obvious objection to the New Testament, and that was, isn't it really filled with contradictions?
One of the issues people often raise is the question of apparent contradictions between the Synoptic Gospels, where there's a parallel story. For example, Matthew tells the story of 2 blind men being healed, whereas in Mark's account there's only 1 blind man. How can we get this contradiction? The vast majority of these apparent contradictions, however, are quite easily resolved. Mark describes only one of the 2 blind men, the one who is most prominent, obviously, or perhaps even the one who became a disciple of Jesus and became prominent in the later church. So most of these apparent contradictions are quite easily resolved.
Had every single account given us exactly the same detail, we might have accused them of some form of collusion, of having gotten together and carefully planned out how they were always going to tell the story with the exact number of details. But then one doesn't have independent testimony at all.
It's natural when you have multiple eyewitnesses to the same event. You're going to get different perspectives, and that's okay. You want that. What you're looking for is a core to the testimony that's the same, that's consistent, even though there may be some variation in the incidental details. If you're in a court of law and you have multiple witnesses come in and testify to the exact same thing, the first objection that's brought up is to say collusion. They got together, they orchestrated their testimony, and their credibility is shot. When I found out that we have no original survivors of the manuscripts of the New Testament, I became very skeptical. Because if all we have are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, then how do we know that what we possess today bears any resemblance to what the original said?
We have better manuscript attestation for the New Testament than any other ancient document. For example, the Bible of the Greeks, Homer's Iliad, is preserved in maybe 600 manuscripts, the oldest of them 1,000 years after the document was actually written. The New Testament, we have something like 5,000 Greek manuscripts. So everyone agrees, whether liberal or conservative, that we have an incredibly reliable New Testament.
We have thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament. We also have virtually the entire New Testament preserved in the quotations of the Church Fathers in the first 4 centuries, so that if we had no copies of the New Testament, we could reconstruct the New Testament from quotations from the early Church Fathers.
Leo Carter is a hero of mine. When he was a young teenager, he saw a gang member murder a local grocer. And very courageously, Leo Carter went to the police and said, "I will testify against that killer." But to prevent that from happening, one day the killer and his gang hunted down Leo Carter and his brother and a friend of theirs, and they brought him to an alley like this one. And they took a gun and they put it to the bridge of Leo Carter's nose, and they pulled the trigger. The bullet went in and it instantly blinded Leo in his right eye. He fell to the ground and then they shot him again in the back. Now they thought that Leo was dead, but he wasn't. And from that position on the pavement, he watched as his brother and his friend were murdered. Later, when I was a reporter at the Tribune, I was there in court and I watched as an incredibly brave Leo Carter, with the bullet still embedded in his skull, testified against those killers and put them away for the rest of their lives. That is the power of eyewitness testimony. And in a similar way, we have testimony from the distant past that can tell us something reliable about what happened a long time ago. In fact, I believe, based on the evidence, that the New Testament Gospels have the earmarks of credibility. They're based on eyewitness testimony. They were written not long after the events they describe. They contain all kinds of embarrassing details that certainly would have been edited out if they were just making this stuff up. They're confirmed at parts by archaeology and secular history, and they've been reliably transmitted to us over time. So I believe that we can trust the Gospels when they tell us about the life, teachings, miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But what do you think? At this stage in your investigation, where would you say the evidence points? Toward or away from the credibility of the New Testament accounts?